was good. That was really good. Okay, so it's with extreme pleasure that I get to introduce tonight's lecturer, who is Kate Orff. Kate is an assistant professor at Columbia University's Graduate School of Architecture, Planning, and Preservation, where she teaches studios and interdisciplinary seminars that focus on sustainable development, biodiversity, and community-based design. With degrees from University of Virginia and Harvard, and professional experience with Hargraves Associates and OMA, she's the founding principal of SCAPE, a landscape architecture and urban design firm in New York. Kate Orff's body of design research focuses on the broad and complex field of the cultural and ecological potentials of urban landscape, with an emphasis on strategizing biodiversity, reclaiming post-industrial land, forging community-based partnerships, and advancing water as a catalyst for urban change in the contemporary city. In her design work on biodiversity, her ambition to produce new ways of seeing and understanding complex environments, as well as to affect change, is close to unmatched in our field today. Some of this fresh thinking appears as the clever design hybridization of habitats. Others, such as the foregrounding of bird life, go further to institute policy to reinforce new practices, which takes the form of readily available building guidelines that can be widely distributed and understood. Other compelling projects on biodiversity, one called the Field Guide to the Flowers That Are Still Here, and another called Safari 7, aspires to educate through creative representational strategies. Not surprisingly, Kate is repeatedly named as a design leader of her generation, both in academic, professional, and more popular media venues. And I see you're the only designer mentioned in the recent issue of National Geographic that was called Rising Seas, only one globally. Additionally, her writing supplements her design work and built projects, co-author of Petrochemical America and co-editor of Gateway, Visions for an Urban National Park. Her essays have appeared in numerous books and journals. I'm particularly struck by her essay called Cosmopolitan Ecologies that advances the muddy ecologies of Jamaica Bay as a venue to rethink the role of the National Park Service, to refocus its mission from an agency that's shifting its emphasis from kind of preserving cultural resources and scenery to one that advances participatory ground-up efforts to affect real ecological change, which has enormous potential. So it's this last point, advancing real change, is how I'd best characterize Kate's work. Acting more like a landscape entrepreneur, her clear thinking and innovative design work is embedded with a tremendous emphasis on and capacity for advocacy. This not only takes the form of new publication formats, disciplinary alignments, and modes of dissemination, but new forms of public space. And this is extremely important for a discipline that too often calls its work public, but fails to reach its audience through contemporary venues and technologies. Kate is one of the most important voices of an emergent landscape architectural practice, which offers new paradigms of thinking, collaborating, and designing. So please join me in welcoming her.
Thank you, Julia. In case I need to do some quick hydrodynamic calculations, I'll pull that board back out. So hopefully everyone can hear me. I'm thrilled, and one of the reasons that I love doing these lectures is because I somehow get to see this body of work through others' eyes, and I appreciate that generous introduction. And it's so nice to be here among so many valued colleagues and friends, and so I'm happy to talk about SCAPE, and I feel somehow liberated by Julia's thick introduction that I can kind of just show the work. So what I thought to do today is really, I've got a lot of slides, but I also go very quickly, so I'm planning to talk for about 45 minutes and then have some time for questions. So I'm going to kind of bring you through the sort of whirlwind. I think the way Julia recounted it, it all sounds very logical and rational, but I think the reality is that, I do see SCAPE as a kind of, and my work as a, I guess you could say like a merge of research, practice, and teaching. But then I think, my background is really, I'm coming at this through before I even went to landscape architecture school at Harvard, I was very interested in politics. I was interested in women's studies. I had this degree called political and social thought. It's one of those degrees that your parents are like, no. And so it was a kind of meld of fine arts, sculpture, environmental sciences, and politics. And so, kind of grasping around, trying to find what is a way to be, efficacious in the world, like how to design, how to think, how to act. And so I really, frankly, just stumbled on landscape architecture as a discipline through this sort of history department in landscape. And I got more and more interested as we went through. Reuben Rainey was the teacher. He has this, he's a kind of famous teacher at UVA. He's almost like a voice like a preacher. And he brought us through from this sort of ancient history to the contemporary garden. And I was really hooked because I saw it as a way to meld activism, art, politics, and environment. And so that's really how I see the world, how I think about things. And at the same time, like many of your instructors, I sort of have one foot in academia in Columbia, where I teach urban design and architecture, and one foot kind of in practice, which frankly has an incredibly different logic. And so anyone who says that, oh yeah, there's this sort of hybrid model of research practice, actually the logics are very, very different. Being successful in the sort of world of practice requires a completely different kind of skill set. There are many ways that we can intersect, but and that's what I've been trying to do. But the fact is, they're very different realms. So, but I think it's exciting to try to think about a sort of a research-driven practice, and frankly, a practice or reality-driven research process. So, what I've tried to do is pull together a set of projects. I mean, I'm very excited. SCAPE has a lot of built work now, which is up on our website. I'm going to talk about, rather than focus on the sort of built work, I'm going to talk about like the projects that I have poured my soul into and that I care deeply about. And so these are these projects that sort of ride the fine line between art and activism and environment. So I thought to start with Safari 7, because this is a project that was originally done with the Urban Landscape Lab, and my close friends Jeanette Kim and Glenn Cummings were collaborators on this. So you can kind of see where this picture is. It's actually in a subway, right? So this is a subway card in New York City on the 7 line. And so Safari 7 was also this kind of project that resulted from a meeting among the three of us that was like, what can we do now? After Jamaica Bay, this big research project, I was kind of trying to act as almost kind of a joint scientist designer. I had thick binders of applications for environmental projects like horseshoe crab restoration and nesting sites, and I just roundly rejected from all of these NSF proposals, all of these kind of real world science proposals. So my instinct was like, what can I do now? So Safari 7 was an idea about almost like a guerrilla project, if you will, that reinterpreted the number 7 train line as an urban eco-safari. It was with student volunteers. One of Jeanette's seminars helped develop a number of the podcasts with the big idea that, the 7 line itself is an urban transect through New York, right? So if you know the sort of Manhattan landscape, or the sort of New York geology, it runs from the bedrock of Manhattan through and under the East River and out above into the sort of glacial outwash plains of Long Island, really out in Flushing. So we saw this kind of ecological tool of a transect as being something that's like a powerful concept, and as a way to bring environmental knowledge and sort of activism and frankly local observations about your lived environment, into a kind of a strategy of organizing that and frankly broadcasting it. So, we came up with this idea. We have these podcasts, and really we had a sort of a number of events that we staged that were on the 7 line, which are these kind of listen while you ride. And so what you do, there's a number of podcasts you download, you listen to them, you can read this little map, and then basically you kind of build up this knowledge base. So that was like riding the train. And then we also had this set of what you call, this one was called the weed walk, for example. So this is one of the most eminent, biologists, Professor Stephen Handel, who's at Rutgers, and a student, Lisa, who is sort of taking notes. So we also began to sort of interview geologists and plant ecologists, and like bringing this further so that you could have sort of a live experience of the the weed walk, and so you could have a different kind of walking experience. We also realized that this was this kind of notion of broadcasting, or a way of kind of conceptualizing how you could organize information so that it could, and concepts so that others could sort of plug into it. We realized that a great idea would be also to try to do some kind of an exhibit where people could sort of literally plug in. So that's me, actually, and that's Jeanette, putting together this puzzle, which became the sort of Safari 7 table. So I think you'll see throughout this lecture that there's a whole range of kind of outputs. There's sort of, activist sort of moments on the train. There's exhibitions that are sort of high, that can bridge between high and low culture, I guess you would say. But the whole idea of, I think, all the work is that, urban ecology is, I think what's funny is this is a venue called Studio X in New York City. So you can imagine like a lot of hipster architects inhabiting this space. But in this space, we also brought the exhibition to Grand Central Terminal and developed a kind of a whole series of basically kind of like what we call the sort of educational toolkit for young elementary school students to be able to kind of experience this. And so it became kind of part of the learning curriculum. So this is like my favorite image, basically, because what it means is that it's not just architects speaking to other architects and landscape architects, blah, 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 who are sort of in our little bubble, but the idea is how can you sort of conceptualize the local environment, conceptualize the world, and make it, and help to kind of communicate it to a broader audience. So that's what that was about. So we had card cards. We actually, through a sort of a fluke, my father-in-law works for the MTA, so we kind of worked the channels and actually got a Metro card ticket printed, which was really exciting. And we distributed these maps all over so people going to the US Open one year got a map of the Safari 7 project, which is a little crazy. But the big, kind of methodology, besides the notion of, how I think about design, is designing tools for others, right? Because you want to make change. You don't want to just have a project and have it sort of sit in its delimited boundary. You want to sort of make a project that is transformational and has like a life beyond you. So, the idea here was for Safari 7 to sort of use the thick section, use the idea of the transect to communicate these ideas. So we developed these kind of 6 key sections, which are these big wall graphics. And so this is just an image from, the Museum of Natural History. These kinds of things really inspire me. It's like a life-size worm. But basically, so this is a kind of a zoom into this one here, decomposers, which is a kind of a snapshot of the nitrogen cycle. It's a way of talking about the nitrogen cycle relative to the cemetery belt in Queens. And so on, the ecology of vacant lots, the kind of weird interspecies dynamics that you see in Bryant Park. And here's the sort of Safari 7's toolkit, rather, that was sort of broadcast to local teachers. And then finally, Jeanette in particular has been taking this sort of more globally, and we've begun to develop Safari 4 Beijing, Rio, and Hong Kong. So it's really exciting because, again, I think it speaks to this notion of design as a tool for others rather than something that is in an end of itself. So a very different project here. This is called Petrochemical America. And this is really a book project. And it's a book project that also started from the basic impulse that landscape architects are somehow missing the big picture. I mean, I would say, I'll put like more designers into that category. We're missing the big picture, which is how, the United States has been transformed into a giant machine for consuming oil, gas, and petrochemicals. And we're all very concerned about our little kind of corner of the world and about materiality and how big something is, or what color it is or whatever. But there's some broader things at stake which have to do with the consumption patterns in the American landscape over the past 150 years. And to me, it was like how to engage with that. I had started a book actually before meeting Richard Misrak, who is the photographer, the amazing photographer, about kind of the regional landscapes in America. And I had this idea about breaking it down into regions and just telling the story of a region through a kind of a detailed look at one place. And then after I met Richard and began to see his body of work that he had built up through photographing this corridor between New Orleans and Baton Rouge, it's about 100 miles between these two cities, that has about over 100 petrochemical facilities and refineries. Basically, I was like, this is the story. I mean, you can tell the entire kind of story of the American rise to power, frankly, and to sort of our economic sort of status through just looking at this place. And Richard's photographs, he's a photographer based in Berkeley, and he does these kind of beautiful, huge, 8x10 photographs that are very stunning. His photographs of this region just, blow me away. And part of what I tried to do is begin to kind of sequence and uncover the stories that are kind of embedded in his photographs that he, as a sort of visual artist, I guess, was not able to tell. For example, this photograph is called the Norco cumulus cloud. So it kind of looks like Central Park, right? Like if you squint, it's like, oh, there's some trees and there's some urban thing here. But of course, this is the Norco oil refinery. This is a big kind of right-of-way for the pipelines. And then this little string of, I don't know if you could see it, but there's like a little string of gray basically has created this kind of artificial toxic weather, which is, they call it the cumulus cloud. They have different cloud pattern formations that they call it. So this is sort of like dioxins and all these sorts of things that are typically, part of the, emissions process here. And so, this is a real story about people living in this environment incredibly close to these plants. And it's a story about public health. This is a super fun site. And it's also a story about social justice and environmental justice. And this is one of Richard's more iconic views of Cancer Alley this is Union Carbide in the background and the cemetery in the foreground. And at Taft, a town called Taft. And so my big kind of question for the book was like, okay, so how, what goes into this landscape, right? You have to sort of like look at this, like put your eyes on reality and try to understand that that's weird. And I think what's kind of fun or interesting is that also I worked with some students and faculty at LSU, and this was kind of like not really on their radar as a site, if you will. Many of them came with us on what we call the toxic tour for the first time and kind of saw these places fresh. But this is a site for landscape architecture. So this is the cover of the book, Swamp and Pipeline near Geismar, where there was an explosion just last year. So how did this water system become like this? And what is the sort of social set of poverty that, and poverty and kind of juxtaposition of poverty and industry? How did that happen? So this is kind of the process. I'll talk a little bit about the methodology of the book, which was that, it was literally sort of what I just said, which is that I went to Louisiana and sort of just like tried to put my eyes on sort of reality, and this is Willie Fontenot, who is a local activist who was basically a community organizer before there was the word community organizer, I suppose, and he had worked in the office of the governor, and basically tried to understand what was going on and sort of reveal and sort of dig past the surface of Richard's beautiful photographs to try to uncover these stories and processes and cycles that are embedded in each and every one of them, because that's another kind of major issue of, I think, architects and designers in the world today. It's like, someone has to start connecting the dots, and we need to be able to start doing that kind of very collectively and show how these sort of processes and patterns are interconnected. So this is basically the kind of table of contents of the book. It's organized, the first chunk is Richard's photographs, and then the second half is what I call through lines, which are, it's a name for a drawing, but the idea is to kind of thread the dots, connect the dots, and connect these kind of concepts which are unconnected in people's minds and but they are embedded in the landscape. So the book is organized into sort of oil, infrastructure, waste, displacement, ecology, food, and landscape. And the idea is, each of these chapters lives in relationship to the one before it and after it. And I wanted to just begin to start to pull together some facets of our built environment that are seemingly disconnected, but that basically create kind of a cycle, a sort of downward cycle of extraction and waste, whereas in landscape, as I know the sort of this is a joint lecture with, so I'll point to my landscape architecture colleagues here. But landscape architecture, I think landscape architects think in terms of systems and connections. And so how can we begin to pull together these sort of downward spirals of displacement and relocation or pollution, toxic legacy, and public health crises, these things that basically end, and a particularly interesting one I think in the book revolves around ecology and food, where you have fertilizer and pesticide production that's coming out of oil and natural gas and coal extraction. Then you have kind of a monoculture, you have obesity, poor nutrition, and then you have the degradation of water, land, and air. So, we're in this kind of spiral where we're living in this bubble of very productive, one would think, the best economy in the world and so on, but this is an economy that is largely built on this oil, this sort of trifecta of hydrocarbons. And so, we're all very clear on what is happening relative to climate change, and how even if we do nothing, we are kind of past 400, we're past all the things that we should not be past. So, how do we actually really re-engage? How do we really begin to break some of these cycles and some of these lines? So that's what the book was trying to do. And the final section of the book is called the glossary. And in that glossary, I kind of go through and highlight ways that people have begun to break this sort of spiral. But back quickly to the photograph, because the photograph is really where it all began. Richard's eye, I thought, was very useful to me as a way of focusing and a way of taking these pictures really as a site. So, I'll just start with this one, because this is a photograph that I kind of, it's like literally you develop a relationship with the photograph. And I mean, to sort of make it kind of funny, but I was like, is this the beginning of the world or the end of the world? Or like, is there a dinosaur this would be crawling by? But it's really interesting because it's Louisiana at sunset, and it has this incredibly brown, beautiful, hazy cast because of the emissions. And so really what I started to do with my favorite photographs was to begin to take each of them and try to extract out different scales. This is a bad sketch, but this is my sketch of like global scale, the sort of Mississippi scale, the Gulf scale, and the site scale, and kind of pull these different aspects of each photograph into a narrative, begin to sequence the photographs, begin to kind of literally unravel a kind of a thread through them, and tell a story that I think hasn't really been told. This is a map of one of the chapters, the first chapter called Oil, and that's that first photograph that you see, which was like, is it the beginning of the end of the world? And I said it was both. And so this oil chapter actually traces through the discovery of oil, why Louisiana is ground zero, if you will, back a century ago for sort of oil and gas production, and then how the oil itself has created, and the complexity of extracting and distributing oil has sort of generated the modern corporation as we know it, and basically how cycles of production and consumption then lead to a sort of a landscape of extraction and waste. So here's that photograph. If you can see, there's a little tick mark there, and there's a tick mark here. So in all of these drawings, you can orient yourself by locating the photograph within it. I thought it was interesting to start the book in terms of where is oil, where does oil come from, and what are we talking about when we talk about this? So this is a view. It's a drawing, and I think maybe it's interesting to talk about drawing for a second because you're students and presumably interested in that. But basically, this is a drawing that melds a kind of a thick geological cross-section, a time scale, obviously, dinosaurs to people, not so clear and direct, and then also the measure of CO2 emissions as recorded at Mauna Loa Observatory. So I think what it kind of tries to do is show that these sort of cycles of carbon are now really literally off the chart, and then that's kind of coalescing in space and time with all these white kind of pieces that indicate offshore drilling spots. And you can really see how we're kind of getting down to these pockets of oil and gas that are tucked underneath the Louisiana landscape and have been developing over millennia under the sort of sedimentation of the Mississippi River itself in that process. So I'm not a chemist. I'm a fan of Breaking Bad, but I am not a chemist. But I got really into petrochemistry, frankly. And, I was really amazed at the story now is not just that, Americans tend to think that, okay, well, gas goes into my car and I drive, and that's what gas is. But the reality is that it's a really complex process, and that a whole suite of, core petrochemicals come out of this process through heat and other sort of chemical and physical change agents. So these kind of are the building blocks of petrochemistry, and literally they become arrayed across the landscape. I mentioned that there's over 100 petrochemical and refineries in this area, and so they become arrayed in the landscape, and so this is basically a mapping of each black dot is a facility, and the set of words around it indicate, what is made there. So as the daughter of an engineer, I'm like, this is amazing, this is so interesting. But as the mother of 2 children, I'm also like, I think that this is maybe bad, PVC and polyvinyl chloride and vinyl chloride monomer and, herbicides and insecticides like atrazine, which are, in many cases, there are known cancer-causing agents, but there are also known endocrine disruptors and many kinds of issues that are associated with these chemicals that, frankly, we just know very little about. So that became the sort of end of this chapter. And then I'm going to kind of speed through some of these images just to sort of put them out in front of you, and if I can always go back to them later. But the book also then goes through how and why is the Louisiana landscape such an amazing hybrid of artificial and natural kind of infrastructures, that it became this sort of, key point in the sort of first phase in our nation's addiction to oil and production. So, I became obsessed with these kind of salt domes. This is a large geological feature that can sometimes go as deep as 4 miles underground that are, they're sort of cleaned out. The brine is used for petrochemical products, and that they are used then as storage pits for natural gas, sometimes for toxic materials, and also they store America's petroleum reserve in these large kind of salt domes. That is to say, it's a real interesting landscape if you're, someone who is. I feel like this is like the new J.B. Jackson, right? I don't know. Is that a reference that falls in deaf ears? J.B. Jackson is an amazing kind of anthropologist / writer and lover of landscapes, and so I feel like this is the new kind of territory for all of us to kind of be thinking about, like what is the landscape that makes a sort of an economy of oil and gas. So I began to kind of learn quite a bit about how oil and gas move through the landscape and what its effects were. And interestingly, Deepwater Horizon occurred while Richard and I were working on the book. And so the last slide for this chapter is about Deepwater Horizon and shows basically, and is our sort of bridge to the next section, which is that waste also is a byproduct of these industrial processes, even though it is seen in many cases as a kind of externalized condition, not necessarily in the business model. But the reality is that waste lives in the landscape and it lives in us. And so this project, this next section, began to look more closely at some of the very startling juxtapositions of where people live with waste. And so everything that's a circle here is, to be sort of a GIS geek, is a circle indicates whether or not it's land, air, or underwater, water-based or below ground emissions. And these are all this is self-reported data, and also how big the emissions was. And this is basically a kind of interpolation of all that data together. So you have these kind of hot spots around places like Geismar, around places like Donaldsonville. And then, of course, anecdotally, I also began to compile and research and compile health stories. So we know, there's in Syngenta, there was a huge atrazine accident, and in Gonzales as well, quite a bit of activity. So, and then, I think many of these kind of health problems are difficult to track. One of my biggest frustrations with this project was that data doesn't overlay necessarily, with how data is collected, doesn't necessarily overlay with actually people's lives and how people report health incidents. But these kind of hotspots kind of began to manifest themselves in my brain as almost like cancerous spots. And so, that sort of is this notion that waste not only is deposited in the landscape and is part of an ecological system, but we carry it in our bodies and in our tissues. And so that becomes a very kind of startling and kind of fact, frankly. And in the writing of this book, I was incredibly careful to only use very predictable sources, the President Obama Cancer Panel, so on and so forth, things that were accepted by the scientific community. So if waste lives in the landscape, a big part of the story of Cancer Alley, I mentioned the words environmental justice before, it was an early place where poor African American communities were settled. Oftentimes, one of the reasons why this place is like it is, and that image of Taft with the cemetery and the chemical facility in the background is what it is that these very large, I guess you could call them plantation homes, switched ownership very quickly to the sort of larger chemical corporations. So you would have, unfortunately, very poor African American communities and poor white communities that lived right near the plantations where they or their families had previously worked or been enslaved at. So you have this really startling juxtaposition also of land use, typology and size, of rich and poor, and of large scale land use with very, very small scale communities. So in this next chapter, which is called Displacement, kind of tell the story in detail of two of those communities that were displaced. This is Morrisonville and Taft. And so, this is one of the things I'm proudest about for this book, frankly, because working with Willie Fontenot, the community organizer, and working with a number of the other activists, many of whom were women, down here, we began to collect all the stories and begin to, if there was no scientific, or if there's no real record, public record of how communities were moved, at least we have it recorded in this book. And so I think, like in the case study of Morrisonville, that was the picture I showed you just here. Morrisonville was originally located outside the levee, then they were moved inside the levee, then Dow came in, then they were moved because they had a huge kind of instance of vinyl chloride poisoning the groundwater, and people drink water at that time. We're drinking from ground wells, and created this incredibly dangerous and toxic condition. So I think the stories of displacement are one of the, I think the things that's like the contribution of this book, at least, what I've been told regionally has been very important for them. So finally, I guess the next chapter was really this notion of ecology and how did, Richard had this amazing photograph of a drowned marsh, basically. How did the Louisiana landscape, which one of Richard's photographs is this kind of big, lush, kind of bature photograph, how did the Louisiana landscape become this kind of landscape of ghostly poles, of cypress trees, and kind of, vacant water, if you will. So this was a big part, and there's that photograph kind of embedded in this drawing here. And the idea with this through line as well was sort of to try to trace time and cycle in the space of a drawing to show how this landscape moved from a cycle of very lush and living, of sort of a looping cycle, to a one-way cycle of extraction and decline. So here's kind of a zoom into that cypress forest, which is one of the most complex ecosystems because it bridges land and water horizontally, vertically, in plan and section, and how that sort of those cypress forests are now really disappearing at an alarming rate, and due to any number of factors, and a combination of factors which are quite deadly: rising sea levels, saltwater intrusion. The map I showed with all the orange lines reaching out into the Gulf, each one of those cuts a transect through the marshlands and becomes a vector for saltwater, which is a pollutant in a freshwater landscape, right? So this ecosystem cannot survive saltwater. And then you have sinking ground, wetland subsidence, and so on, in addition to the cocktail, if you will, of other petrochemicals that I showed earlier. So, it becomes a really startling kind of moment when you realize that there is a connection between this landscape and the plant, not so far away. It may not be as direct as you imagine, but it's there. The next chapter is food, and the idea of food being that, a rich kind of thick landscape requires, and how basically the role of a kind of a robust landscape is playing out at the national scale, and how Louisiana went from a place that was a provider of seafood and shrimp and rich sources of protein, but through this kind of Faustian bargain that they have made, which is that they've become a kind of an exporter of pesticides, nitrogen-based fertilizers, and so on, and these kind of plants barge the pesticides, herbicides, and fertilizer up the Mississippi to the Corn Belt and to the soy belt. This water comes back down the Mississippi in the form of basically waste, toxic waste, if you will, and then kind of ruins the very waters that Mississippi has made its original, economy from. So this kind of Faustian bargain is something I thought that was really another story that is untold, in the American landscape. And it's the sort of scale that I think we have not addressed yet, right, as a kind of in our dialogue. And so where can we have this conversation about the national landscape and how we need to begin to start at changing processes at larger scales that are beyond the scale of an individual site. And this kind of dead zone mapping really kind of hit that home, I think. And everything in yellow is a mapping of nitrogen application and atrazine application. And so finally, the book ends with this sort of homage to what I call like the landscape we have made, which is, this notion of, we have, I'm speaking generalities here, but yes, we have made bigger and bigger houses. They are farther and farther apart. They are filled with more and more stuff. This stuff is petrochemical. The house itself is made out of plastics, vinyls, and petrochemicals. We're consuming more and more gas to get in between the houses that are more and more giant, that are filled with more and more stuff. We're, the houses themselves are bigger and bigger, and it starts to, call into question this notion of settlement pattern and how is it that we can have a kind of more productive conversation in schools of architecture and in schools of planning that try to address these concerns and issues more regionally to, lower our consumption of gas and oil and so on. So that was really this kind of the glossary of this last piece was about, the terms and solutions. Because again, not unlike Safari 7, my thought was here, okay, so everyone's reads the book and they're like, oh God, it's gloom and doom. But it's not gloom and doom, because the idea with this part of the book is that it's really starting to focus on people who are breaking those cycles in the chain and this sort of downward spiral, and how, different, and we focus on whether it's people working at the scale of sort of small community-based organizations or state legislatures, many, many different scales of kind of advocacy are highlighted here. And basically, these become the kind of toolkit for moving forward. And the idea is basically that this would be sort of an expanding kind of knowledge base about ways to make change. The project also lives on as an exhibition, like a traveling exhibition, and Richard's photographs, which are normally like big and fancy and thousands and thousands, $25,000 or whatever, he just said, okay, I'm just going to pin them up on board. And so we tried to make this show that was easy and accessible to travel. And so the idea also with the show, and it's been to a number of different kind of teaching museums, the idea with the show is also that we also have a big kind of process wall that shows you, I don't know, it's kind of, maybe it's interesting, but you can sort of see the sketches and the sort of design process that goes into making a book like this, which was super intense. The idea is too, wherever the show is, we have these kind of workshops. This is a workshop from Environmental Health Action Network. At Stanford, they did a series of programming about the future of energy and so on that basically talk to the concepts of the show and moving forward. So I'm going to show maybe one more project really quickly. This is a project that your dean knows something about. It's called Town Branch Commons, and it's basically sort of an idea about reinventing Lexington's downtown through looking at a former ecological asset that ran through its center called Town Branch. This was the mayor's idea. And so we entered a kind of international competition, were selected, and so this is Lexington, Kentucky. So kind of a core idea of our project was that, Lexington has a kind of vision. When you think of Lexington, you think of like healthy horses, healthy horses and amazingly delicious Kentucky bourbon and so on. So as I started this project, it's sort of a dark secret, but as I started this project, I was like, why is it that, why, this is what I know about Lexington, so what's at the root of this? And through kind of a series of research, it was like the root of the beauty of Lexington and the kind of what makes this area unique is its actual underlying geology, which is that of karst, kind of limestone-based landscape. So that's what the project is about. So this is Town Branch Commons downstream. It looks very pristine, right? But any kind of landscape architect knows that this is sort of a denuded landscape. And actually this is carrying untreated sewage water. And this is kind of more obviously not pristine, and it's right in the center of Lexington. This is also the center of Lexington. This is also Town Branch. Town Branch exists right now as a culvert underneath a central artery in this city. This is what it looks like. This is Town Branch. So it was quite a stretch, right, to kind of imagine that as a kind of generator of urban development and excitement. So here's the path of that culvert. And our strategy for this was to kind of reinvent and think about this river not as a line, right? Because that's like what's in your mind's eye about what a river is. It's a kind of a squiggly blue line, and that's water. But the reality is that is not what water is in a karst limestone landscape. And it's also not how cities work. I mean, I think one of the things that's interesting about SCAPE is we have this sort of love and understanding of urbanism, and we have an equal and opposite love and understanding of ecology and systems. And so I think the kind of ways that cities work has also deeply affected our thinking. So we divided the sort of project into 4 different development zones that are associated with 4 different ways of treating and thinking about the water: reveal, clean, carve, connect. And so there's the master plan. Okay, here's Lexington. Remember what I said about karst? This is a map of karst geology. It's like a bullseye right in the center. And so what we did is basically interpret how karst and water moves through the karst landscape. It doesn't move in a straight line. It goes up and down, and it'll disappear for half a mile and reappear in the form of boils downtown where it bubbles up unexpectedly. And so we began to interpret this kind of disjunctive pattern into the downtown. So here I'll just go quickly through some ways that water appears in the karst landscape. Blue holes, ponds, interrupted stream channels, swallets where it literally goes in and down and disappears. Karst windows where you can see below, stone fences where you can see it stacked, falls where you even have a very thin amount of water is revealed in its vertical change. These kind of beautiful horizontal outcroppings. Sinks, boils, my favorite new word, boils, which is where the water will come from an underground stream and reappear. But of course, this is the urban boils moment, right? We're downtown. Here we go. And so that was the insight of the project, was to reinterpret the hydrology of the karst landscape into a very, very dynamic and city. So reveal, clean, carve, connect, and these are the kind of zones that you can imagine. And each of these sections, for these sections, I'll show very quickly, but you can see the former location of the culvert and its kind of new path. So this is a zone where the water was actually already revealed behind Rupp Arena. Any basketball players out there? This is the famous Lexington, UK Rupp Arena. And we basically proposed a sort of a park, but a park that didn't only, a regional destination park that would not only create these kind of spaces and programs for residents, but also serve as sort of hydrological function in terms of flooding, right? So this is actually just the stream floods, so you can have a flood in a downtown. But we created these series of cells, which are these flooding cells that would be able to marshal and organize the water. Here's a kind of a before and an after shot of the Rupp Arena in the background and sort of floodable landscape in the ecological zone there. Clean, a zone of the downtown, a lot of green infrastructure, projects and thoughts about materiality that emphasize the porousness of karst geology. This is a paving pattern study. Carve places where we discovered that there was a sort of a very vibrant art scene in this part of town, and so we wanted to make a landscape that facilitated this growing art scene. And you can see, and created these sort of different topographies to facilitate sort of cultural programming. And that's a sort of view of that. And then finally, Connect. Lexington has a really interesting patchwork of African American communities, predominantly white communities. And so the idea with Connect was this notion of the headwaters. The town branch actually receives its water from this sort of the upper headwaters point. So we really thought that that was our kind of community headwaters as well. So we really designed a lot of connective local programming to bring it together. Okay, so I'm going to talk for maybe 5 or 10 more minutes, and just because this is all one project. What's exciting about this last project is that it's a reinvention of like New York's harbor. And what's exciting is it started in the scale of museum and like the white walls of museum as a project called Oyster Texture, which I did as part of Barry Bergdahl's organized show called Rising Currents. But then now it's become basically like a planning project in the office and an actual kind of construction project. So, you know, the project of Oyster Texture was really a kind of strategy of looking to the past to see what sort of ecological signatures and geomorphology, this is my other favorite new word besides karst, has been like prototypically protective, right? So we began to look at how past geographical signatures had protected New York City. Here's an example, 76 of, this is showing, this is Governor's Island, REDHOOK, showing basically how settlement basically happened at the high ground, but that there was this kind of protected ring of shoals and sandy beaches that in fact protected, you know, people who were living there. So I kind of was like, well, that kind of makes a lot of sense. And how can we begin to use history as a way of dealing with the future, or as a way of connecting people, right, with dealing with the future? Because when I say use history, maybe that sounds cynical, but I think a big point of what I've been trying to do is, hopefully you can see in the work, is how to make real connections with people so that it's not, you know, the plan doesn't sit on the shelf and people are inspired by it and are interested in it. So the project's, I think, main insight was that we can begin to address ecological restoration, or I would say restoration not to this group, but ecological kind of rebuilding with, and coastal resiliency strategies with habitat. So that's it. That's the key insight. Taking these two things, which are literally, you know, I've been dealing a lot with the Army Corps lately. They're two separate projects in the Army Corps of Engineers, how they do things, and pulling them together. So we began to look at a range of sort of offshore reefs and inland structures and processes that would basically begin to redevelop these kind of former ecological systems. And I kind of fell onto this charismatic animal of the oyster because it can clean water, it can agglomerate into reefs and beds and help to attenuate wave action. So history became, I mean, I told you I was sort of coming from this interdisciplinary background and took a lot of history, but history became a way of kind of opening up a door to the future. And I think this project has hopefully helped to change some of the dynamic. So oysters can agglomerate into reefs. There are these keystone species upon which many other species depend. And so a kind of another insight of this particular project was that the life cycle of the oyster shown here, where it goes from sperm, egg, fertilized egg to spat on shell, right here, into a reef, that life cycle could be sort of reinterpreted at an urban scale and in an urban context. So with a cleaner GOWANUS canal post-Superfund, we imagined that these oyster nurseries could sort of begin to develop here in the GOWANUS canal. The spat would be sort of barged out and placed on these developing reef, which is like literally how it happens in aquaculture, and bring these techniques of aquaculture into an urban environment and try to reset this downward negative spiral. So we began to research and more recently have been doing that in great depth with folks from the Stevens Institute of Technology and looking at hydrodynamic modeling, how these reefs would actually perform. And so basically, that is what we're working on now. You know, the idea was that you create a kind of a shoal and an in-water structure that is a wave attenuating structure, but that structure can be a kind of signature new blue kind of amphibious park for the next century, our watery century. Many of you may have already seen a lot of this stuff. That was the Flupsy Parade. So that's a not published image, which maybe I should dwell on, but this is the same. Flupsy Parade. I'm working here, don't eat me. All this stuff that didn't make the cut going into the books, right? You had to put that on the shelf. But basically, I think, you know, I talked about this notion of the thick section that we developed for Safari 7, and also in Petrochemical America, a section that tells a story about a landscape in space and time. And that's really what this drawing is. It's a section that's telling a story where you have this sort of, you know, fair, cloudy weather coming in, the waves being attenuated by the shoal and reef and bed system, and then the cooler, cleaner, calmer water, which enables a different kind of access to that water. And so oyster texture is being pulled through in a number of different ways, both big and small, which is very exciting to me. On the one hand, we have a pilot project, which is in the Gowanus Bay. And on the other hand, I've been working on, with the City of New York and others, this kind of huge regional planning now, also with Hank Ovink, who I know spoke with you recently as part of the HUD Rebuild by Design process. So a couple of images of our Habitat Pier project. One of the things we were researching was the idea of repurposing aquaculture techniques in an urban environment. And so we kind of landed on this, the mussels. So I talk about oyster texture, but it's also very, you know, directed. It's really about oysters and mussels and eelgrass and this whole kind of suite of species. But so we decided to kind of work with Sims Metal Management, which is a pier located here, to develop kind of a pilot project off of their working industrial reef. And we also began to work with this group called SIRR, and they're on our HUD Rebuild by Design team as well, to look at other materials and try to test materials in the New York Harbor landscape. So this is SIRR's work. But I became really fascinated about, you know, how they're looking for biological recruitment on, you know, concrete, low pH concrete, and how there are micro and macro textures that and different concrete mixes that are suitable for different environments, and how these different textures recruit biological life. So that is what we're doing now. That is my HUD project, and it's very exciting. So this is the kind of plan for Sims Metal Management. This is their pier installed. Another big thing that we were interested in is how is this concept of coexistence. Everything that I try to do is about living with water and alongside animal species. And so this project speaks to coexistence. There's a shoal nearby. This is an image of their facility. And so we designed this kind of pilot project for fuzzy rope to see if we could recruit mussels, and we did. So this is the pilot, how it's laid out with subtidal and intertidal panels. And we installed basically last March an image of how we're trying to set into motion a kind of a ecology and pull together the recently made shoal into the landscape. We did a sort of fuzzy rope knitting party. If anyone's got really big, no needles involved, just a lot of knot making. And what's very exciting is we've got mussels. And, you know, so I think this project is great in that, you know, it was basically this sort of community design, you know, community inspired project where we actually got a lot of people from the Gowanus Canal Conservancy to help, you know, knit the rope. And we created these how to make a fuzzy rope panel kind of toolkits. And then we tested it in the water. And what's exciting too is that more and more diversity comes up on this rope. We have fish and crabs, and there's a green crab, and all different kinds of species sort of are attached to it. So that was the kind of small pilot project. And I think what's exciting is also that oyster texture is now kind of part of the New York City plan for coastal resiliency for the next, you know, until 2050. So in the office, we worked on what's called the SIRR Coastal Protection Plan as a sub to PB. But this was a great project that pulled forward a lot of the techniques that we had been developing post-oyster texture, which is how to work with hydrodynamic modeling to test the efficacy, to test the effectiveness of where these in-water reef structures or breakwater structures, and how would they be effective and where. So this entire project, we worked in a kind of an iterative, collaborative way with these hydrodynamic modelers to understand where you could intervene either onshore or in the water. And we also overlaid that with a kind of a habitat protection drawing. So I think what's exciting is there is a whole kind of suite of proposals in the SIRR report, which is a special initiative for rebuilding resiliency, that have kind of resulted in what I would like to say sites for oyster texture. So I'm really excited about moving forward and testing these. And these were some of our results about Jamaica Bay. And what was quite interesting is, even with Jamaica Bay, is there's this kind of debate out there now about green versus gray infrastructure. It makes no sense to me whatsoever. I'm always called up to be like the green infrastructure person, but all I care about is what is effective. I don't care what color it is. And the idea is that, but you know, what are the co-benefits, right? Because often we've learned that traditionally known as gray infrastructure is a kind of a monofunctional solution. It can fail, and it also does not have co-benefits. I'm interested in kind of infrastructure in a much more expanded context that has public space benefit, ecological benefit, habitat value, and a whole suite of things. So this is a sort of a geek out moment, but what we learned that just by shallowing Jamaica Bay, it's equally effective to protect all cement settlement inland as is a gate at its edge. Pretty exciting. And so I guess just to sort of close, right now, you know, so these are our, I don't know what this is, but to close, you know, our park for, this is our attempt is what it is to design these breakwaters, which we're doing now in much more detail with better engineers. To close, you know, Henk Ovink talked about the HUD Rebuild by Design competition. And that's another way that I think we begin to even further expand out the scale of taking this kind of core insight of overlaying coastal protection or coastal resiliency with habitat regeneration. So my site, I've kind of rethought of our entire, like the sandy affected area, and kind of called our project the Shallows, which are these bays, the system of bays that are in great peril due to sea level rise and surge and hurricane activity. So New York is actually quite lucky in that we have a lot of high ground, and many are not as lucky. But so it's a project that starts to look at overlaying ecology and coastal resiliency, understanding what the typologies of landscapes are in the shallows and how they're effective, and basically how to begin to rebuild the shallows and how these shallows that are endangered, frankly, the bay is an endangered landscape, how they've been effective, how they've protected the communities around them in the past, and what are kind of strategies for reclaiming those bays. So I'm really excited about that particular project because that's another way that these sort of sets of design ideas and research are moving forward. So with that, back from research, back to practice, back to research, back to practice again, I will close and say thank you. I've shown you a lot, but I hope you stay with me. It's 7, so I'm sure many of you want to go, but I'll take a question.
We have time for a couple questions.
Yeah.
Do we have to wait?
Yeah. Everyone's hungry.
Okay, there's a question there. I have to see something.
I want to say thank you for the lecture. It was really good. As a resident of the semester, quite a bit back again, I wanted to ask you about
we struggled with that book is who is the audience? And ultimately, I think we made the book without really being able to answer that question. But I think what has been very interesting is, so a hero of mine is Wilma Subra. She is a chemist who is from, actually she's like an hour south of New Orleans. And she's someone who originally was employed by the chemical industry to go in and test, and she was not allowed to show residents the results of their testing. And so basically she sort of stopped doing that and became like almost an independent citizen monitor. And so she now independently sort of tests soil, air, and water. She shows people how to do it themselves to kind of empower them to be able to kind of understand their immediate environments and understand any threats they may be facing. So I think Wilma is a kind of a model of someone who, is able to kind of bridge that divide, and she tells stories, almost exactly as you have said. She tells stories about how in many cases, she's kind of shunned, and she was like, there was a bullet that went through her house at one point, but, and it's very serious. It's very serious down there. But at the other hand, she's actually had people who are more sort of executives in the company who approach her and say, actually, okay, it happened to me now. My son is ill, or my wife is ill, and like, what do I need to know, and how can I change? And so, I mean, I think there's an old saying that the flag of Texaco flies over Louisiana, which actually it's now Chevron, so that saying doesn't work anymore because it's been bought by Chevron. But I do think that there's also this amazing kind of grassroots organization there. So we were working with this organization called LEAN, the Louisiana Environmental Action Network. We had interviewed Wilma Subra. We interviewed folks from the Louisiana Bucket Brigade. And so I would totally agree that I think that and also another person who was very important for us, who was our kind of representative of the chemical industry, came to my lecture at Tulane, and we actively interviewed him throughout the process, and he kind of unveiled the sort of mysteries and wonders of the actual chemistry that's going on there. And he in the end too was like, I get it, I don't agree with it, but I think that there's that to me was a very kind of satisfying, exchange in the world that seems to be very polarized, but where, with Randy and with these other kind of folks from the chemical industry, we were able to kind of have a conversation based on data. And I was very also sensitive about, originally the Richards photographs were titled Cancer Alley. So I'm sure you've heard that statement before. And we very deliberately didn't call the book Cancer Alley because that kind of has a stigma attached with it. And we tried to, reveal and tell the stories of the people that we had interviewed, but without trying to, but making it more of a kind of a national story than very much a local story. So, I don't know, that's a couple of thoughts related to your question. It's a great set of observations, and I think that applies to many other regions around the United States where there's this perception that it's an either-or equation. You can either have industry or environment, and I would like to posit that you have to break through that.
Your oyster project, oyster texture, is that a result of Hurricane Sandy or came before?
It was done in 2009, so it was before Irene and Sandy. And I think others who were in the Rising Currents show would kind of say, we did all these maps of like, oh, category 3, and you'd be like, oh, ha ha ha, but category 3 storm surge plus sea level rise, whoa, okay. But it was very, everyone who's kind of done those mapping projections was very startled that they were very, they kind of came true in a very horrified way. And so it helped to have that material sort of out there in the public realm, because I think it helped to shape the post-Sandy discussion in a productive way.
So, first of all, good afternoon, and I want to say thank you so
approach or approaches that have allowed you and your colleagues to develop a stronger and more efficient form of resilience in the landscape, plus also, something that has helped you, we have found out really helpful in inspiring the communities and the members of this community for them to become involved?
Right. I mean, it's a great question, and I can't, because this is a competition, I wasn't able to show like the project for HUD, but that's kind of exactly what we're working on, and I've been very aggressive in trying to define resiliency as well. I mean, so a little bit of a sort of roundabout way to answer your question, but for example, in the New York context, in Staten Island, well, I guess it's quite small here, but in this area of Staten Island, there were a high number of deaths in Staten Island. And, what happened was there's a giant berm in Staten Island that immediately became overtopped and flooded the area behind it, and that water stayed. So people living behind that berm didn't necessarily perceive the threat of the water coming. The water was actually rising something like, I think it was like 2 feet per hour, or something that's very perceptible. But the fact that we were thinking about coastal protection in terms of building a wall versus resiliency, which is kind of having a sort of more integrated understanding of your environment, I think created, made Hurricane Sandy into, not unlike Hurricane Katrina, in some ways a man-made disaster, if you will, because of the failure of infrastructure and the distance between people and their immediate environment, because you didn't have this kind of learning and perception built into the landscape. So I guess what we've been trying to do with the sort of shallows strategy, with this ecological infrastructure strategy, is communicate that if you're living by the water, you are not 100% safe. Resiliency means being able to kind of bounce back, to be able to be potentially flooded, but not critically damaged. And and then the other way that we're trying to intervene is by sort of introducing sort of points of sort of water culture. The thesis is that, Central Park and the park system in New York has a very clear set of programs and facilities that enable parks programming to happen. We do not have that for the waterfront. So part of my HUD project is imagining a sort of set of structures and landscapes that basically facilitate that sort of community direct interaction. So I think that's how you get people and communities inspired by it. Yeah, and just to sort of go back to the Staten Island thing, that our coastal protection strategies in the form of levees have been largely effective with the sort of concept of protecting property, but they have been not effective in protecting life because of the surprise factor and the fact that people are very connected from their immediate environment. And so it's kind of just an interesting, a different way of looking at it. Yeah.
So I was just kind of really interested in your research and how much content you put into every single project that you do. And I was wondering if you could give a little background on, I guess, your process on starting that research, because I feel like for a lot of students, we can get these projects and then go directly to Google and try and find information that way. But is there more, I guess, I'm just wondering your process behind that.
Yeah, I showed the snapshot of the petrochemical process wall. I would love to, I should probably show that more because I think that's a little bit of a window into the process. With that particular project, it was very much a kind of, I was a student of Rem Koolhaas's at Harvard in his first kind of Harvard project on the city before it was even called that. It was just a Mode B thesis, which is a written thesis. So, and my own way that I interact with the world is very much about like physically going somewhere. Michael knows when we're doing this project for Town Branch Commons, I went to Lexington for 3 days and I was crawling around the city and its environs and, going out to these weird parks that probably not a lot of people have been to and kind of poking around. So a lot of my research process is very kind of visceral and place-based and very intuitive. And then I think the other thing is that I have this sort of way of sort of trying to sequence and build. I have a lot of experience making books, so I almost think about a project as a narrative in sort of a book form. So a lot of how I begin to work is categorizing research topics, sequencing them, and sort of trying to thread them, thread them together. So it's not a lot of Google, actually. It's a little bit more kind of interviewing and place-based stuff.
Take one more question and then.
There's one. Alan, hey.
Hey.
Good.
Yeah, thanks a lot for the great lecture. I guess let me expand on that and this idea of research and practice. I mean, it seems like that the kind of like the sites of your engagement or or like where you work is in these systems and infrastructure ecologies, and these invisible or like larger than visible kind of real-time moving dynamics, which in a conservative notion of what design is, which is maybe making of objects, making of images, construction management maybe at the end, are kind of usually like outside of what's like the frame of the discipline, and but it's with your work, and particularly in the success of your work, it kind of shows that these are not things that can just be left to engineers or scientists, and that they need design, or they're like a area where this works, and that also in your working methods, it's a lot of them about making images and making visible and production of highly designed objects and images. And so my question is, like, what's the mode of practice that you're proposing? Is this new? What's the expertise of a designer that works in this mode?
I think, the mode of expertise is, I think, synthesis, in a way, right? Like I keep talking about like these fragments and fragmentation of landscape systems, fragmentation of the way that we kind of perceive different aspects of the world. So I think that's what I try to bring as a sort of synthesis of a number of ways of describing the world that may not be, that the wires may be crossed in a number of different ways. So I think it's interesting because I feel like I've kind of found the projects that can benefit from that way of seeing the world, namely like this HUD resiliency project where Hank Ovik is like, reimagine the region. So I'm like, okay, I can do that. It's not really it's not, the expertise is really something that doesn't always, find its client. But I think I've been quite lucky in some cases where I've been trying to make a case for the synthetic mode of thinking and the way that a design project can, through a narrative and through a kind of physical intervention, begin to pull together strands of concepts that are kind of seemingly unrelated and into I think a project that can sort of hold itself together. And another thing that's been kind of what I've begun to learn is that so much is out of the control of the architect or landscape architect that by putting these kind of bigger synthetic visions forward, you have much more, you have a larger watershed, if you will, or influence shed, and you can touch a lot of different people and a lot of different stakeholder groups that wouldn't necessarily come to the table or kind of be have the sort of grounds for having a discussion. So I think that's the expertise. Thanks. Thanks for sticking around. Thanks for your questions.